Okay, thank you so much for coming today. We are talking about preteens and teenagers and asking the question I get often from families, which is this normal or is this adoption related behavior? My name is Heather Sloan, and I am the director of the Post Adoption Connection Center here at Nightlight, focused on support for families, children, and birth families after adoption. What we're going to be covering today is really asking that question, is this behavior normal or is this adoption? We're going to explore some different child development theories, so don't check out on me if you don't love to sit in theoretical. I'm going to make it very practical and understandable as to why these child development theories really can play out in front of our eyes with kids to help understand them. And then we're going to discuss some typical behaviors with what I call the adoption add-on. So some things to keep in mind if your child has any developmental delays, right? So when we talk about what is typical, what is normal, that is, again, that typical child around that age. So if your child does have developmental delays in any area that we're talking about today, just keep that in mind. So they may not be operating at that level. They may not be doing some of those things that maybe their peers are doing. And that's a little bit of that adoption add-on that I'll describe in just a moment. But just be mindful of that. And I know that I'm mindful of when I say typical, it may not always include every child. Trauma can come prenatally through abuse, through neglect, and traumatic experiences for these kids. And I'm going to be using kind of trauma as a big catch-all term for just these difficult things that have happened to children all the way back to their prenatal experience. And then when I'm using terms like typical and this adoption add-on is kind of what I'm saying. The reason I do that, because my answer to the question, is this adoption or normal, is yes. Okay, so meaning that what your child is doing, that you're scratching your head over, or not understanding, or beating your head against the wall, is often typical, right? It is very often what a child of that age or that developmental age would be doing. And that adoption piece, the trauma impacts, just makes it a little more sensitive, a little more intense, or maybe a little more dulled. That kind of brings it to the edges of what would seem typical. So trying to figure and parse out exactly what's adoption, exactly what's typical, for me, that is not the right question, or at least the right answer to this question, but instead it is, okay, I'm going to accept that there is some hard stuff in my child's age and stage. There is difficult behaviors. They're working through big emotions, and that is hard for every parent. And the adoption piece makes it a little bit harder. So I think I like the way I talk about it, just to keep both of those things in mind so that we aren't separating off, oh, well, my child's behaving this way only because of the adoption. And if the adoption was different, or if that was handled differently, then that wouldn't be happening, which may or may not be the case. So why do we ask this question as parents? One big reason is because we don't know child development. So unless you went to school for a degree, or you've done some very particular studying into child development, or have some work experience in one of those areas, you may not know, right? And so it's a very normal question. I'm more educated and trained in this and experienced because this is what I do. My spouse is always asking me, like, is this normal? Like, is this what our toddler is doing right now? Is this normal? And I'm like, yeah, that's toddlers. So it's, we just don't have the training in that. We also ask this question because our child's behavior very often can trigger our own fear and our own insecurity, and feelings of out of control. And so that question starts to birth out of, what is wrong with this kid? Are they ever going to be different? Is this a phase, or is this what trauma has done to them and they're always going to be like this? Or is it going to get worse, right? All of those thoughts are rooted in our own fears and insecurities as parents, which is very normal. Whether you have an adopted child or not, right? As parents, it's very easy to fall into these patterns of fearful thinking and hoping the worst doesn't happen. And so just being aware that sometimes that's where this question can come from. And then also, we are very hyper vigilant with our child's behavior. You get really trained during this process to watch for those trauma impacts and to be prepared for those. And I find working with families, they are often looking very closely at everything that is happening with their child and picking it apart and watching for anything that is negative or outside of what we would consider to be typical because they want to understand. They want to see, okay, this is an adoption behavior. So we're asking that question because we're so hyper vigilant and often are potentially overthinking or over analyzing what could be very typical child behavior because we're looking for that trauma. So a personal challenge I want to extend to you today is to first have some compassion for yourself and compassion for your child. Parenting is hard and being a teenager is really hard. It's hard for everybody. It's a roller coaster of a stage, especially for the child, and then the parent gets pulled onto that roller coaster. There's a lot going on inside their little bodies and their minds and their emotions during this phase. Toddlers and teenagers are some of the hardest stages to parent because of that, because of what is going on internally inside the child. It is a massive leap in development and it is inherently difficult. So wanting you to be mindful, to have compassion for your child and then compassion for yourself at the times that you are frustrated with them, that it is hard for you because it is. I want to ask you to examine your behavior and responses to your child and to think about maybe even some of the discipline you're using in dealing with some of these difficult teenage behaviors that you're seeing, to examine that with honesty and again, compassion. That sometimes as parents, we can be the ones that escalate a situation, or we can be the ones that are actually making it worse. And that's just the reality of it. Like, we come into parenting with our own backgrounds, our own histories, our own thoughts and feelings, and fears and concerns and insecurities. And so sometimes we can be parenting out of those places, and it's not really helping and aiding our child. So my hope today is for you to walk away with some understanding for your child, some renewed compassion for them, and some renewed compassion for yourself as you think about parenting them. Okay, so with brain development, our brains develop from the back to the front. So you can see here on this diagram that orange part, that brainstem, is where infants are operating out of, right? That is where our fight, flight, or freeze is located. That is the primitive center of our brain. An infant's only job is to stay alive. And so they start crying, they freak out when they have a need, and their body, their brain starts sending off alarm bells. There's something wrong, you need something. And the baby cries out, the parent understands their cry, meets their need, and then the baby is comforted. And then that cycle continues to grow when that's done in a healthy way. And then that brain development goes from the back up to the front. I've done 2 other webinars focused on kind of toddler preschool and then another one on the school age. I'm going to be touching on a little bit of those phases as we go forward because as you think about this brain development, this foundation is being built as you get older. And that yellow part in the front, that frontal cortex, that's where logic and reasoning and higher level thinking comes. And we've always heard the jokes that front lobe is not fully developed until 25 years old, right? So even when we look at young adults thinking your brain is still not even developed. And so understanding that and keeping that in mind, I think can help you with your expectations of your children and recognizing that they may not be able to do the thing you are asking or expecting of them simply because their brain has not developed that skill yet. We haven't gotten there. And it's not because they're trying to be defiant. It's not because they're incapable. And in some ways, they are incapable, not because they have the skill and they don't want to use it, but they just simply don't know what you're asking them to do. Their brain can't function in that way yet. So keeping this in mind is really important as we progress forward. Ages 12 to 18, so this adolescent time, this front cortex, that yellow center is what's starting to come online. And this is going to be where math, performance, abstract cognition starts to come into play. They're thinking at a more abstract level instead of a very basic black and white, if I can't see it, I can't understand it kind of level. Their values, their beliefs, and their morality is starting to form in this age range. So really being mindful, if we're talking about a child in your home right now that's 12 or 13, they are only barely starting to understand their beliefs and their morals. And it's really not until 18 and almost up to 25 where that's really being solidified. So this is a very long stage of that slow development. So keeping that in mind. And this front part is where logic and reasoning come in, which that is what can be so challenging with our kids. You look at them and think, why are you doing this? This doesn't make sense. Why? And they may not be able to make sense of it themselves. They may not have a reason, may not have a logic that they can put their finger on and explain to you because that's just not formed yet. Okay, we're going to start with Erikson, and this is one of the more commonly known types of theories if you've touched anywhere close to child development and in any type of human development. This focuses on emotional development, and he has listed out stages that go throughout the lifespan. And in each stage, there is a positive trait and a negative trait that are developed. So ideally, we want everybody to achieve success in the stage that they are in and receive that positive trait. And if they don't, if they come out of that stage without receiving that positive trait, instead they have that negative trait, and that will continue to move forward with them. So especially in this theory, I really want you to think about your kids when they came into your home, how they are now, and then what their first couple of years of life was like. If you know their history, you may or may not have information on where they were, you may or may not have details. But wondering and just being able to kind of think about, were they in a place where they had a loving and attentive caregiver that was helping to build some of these foundations? Because if they didn't, then you are still working with a teenager that still has mistrust, right? Which is so common with our adopted kiddos. And that's going to be influencing that attachment, influencing the relationship that you're trying to build and that emotional connection. So we want to talk about ways to go back and kind of redo earlier phases if you feel like they didn't get resolution. And there's different ways that we can do that. At the end of the presentation, my contact information will be on the slide. You are welcome to reach out to me to just talk through and problem solve. Hey, I think my teenager really still has mistrust issues. How can I build trust with a 16-year-old? So this first stage, I'm going to go kind of briefly through these earlier stages, but they're important to build on. So in that birth to 1 year old, it is all about trust and that cycle of security that I talked about earlier. The child is upset, they cry, the parent meets their need, the child is settled, and they learn to trust. They learn that when I use my voice, somebody hears me and somebody responds, and they meet my need. They're regulated by their parent. They can't regulate themselves. They can't calm themselves down. They need somebody else to meet all of their needs. They can't do it themselves. And that's where that trust is built. And where we see mistrust if a child did not get to function in that cycle of security. Stage 2, kind of getting into toddler, is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So this is really a place where they learn control over their own body, which is why we typically potty train during this age. They are learning how to hold on to something and let go of something in a very physical context, but also how that translates into an emotional context. They're starting to understand that they have control over their body, over their thoughts, over their emotions, right? This is just kind of starting. So they walk out of this stage with autonomy, with feeling like they have some independence. They can operate on their own. They are not only controlled by somebody else. And if they don't achieve autonomy in this stage, then they walk out of it carrying shame and carrying doubt, which again is something that we very commonly see in our foster and adopted children. Is they sit so close to that shame center. And sometimes that can come from all the way back in this stage when they didn't have a parent that was helping them learn autonomy with confidence, that you have control over you. You aren't being only controlled by somebody else. Stage 3 is initiative and guilt. This is getting into the preschool ages. This is where play becomes very important, and they learn that they not only have control over their own body, but they have control over themselves and the environment that they're in, right? So that's where play really comes in, where they can make up, pretend play. manipulate toys to do what they want them to do and to act out the play that they want to act out. So this successful resolution helps them learn how to take initiative over their environment, that they have some control. And if they don't develop that, then they develop guilt, that there is something wrong with them. It starts getting into their self-worth, that shame and doubt continuing to be prevalent. So again, just catching us up to the teenage years here, 6 to 12, this is when school starts, and this is industry. This is school and the skill building that they can learn through being in school. So this is on an intellectual level, on a physical level, cognitive, all of these different things coming into play. And they can learn how to produce something, that they can be given a problem and can start to find a solution to that. This is why we have kids go to school during this stage, because this is an important time for them to learn and grow in this phase. If they are not successful in this is where we see a lot of low self-esteem coming out. So if you see that your teenager really struggles with that low self-esteem, which again, very common in our adopted children, then you'll see kind of coming back to this stage can be helpful in helping them build skills and build confidence and build self-esteem back up, even in very small and practical ways. And then we get into the adolescent stage here in stage 5. This is identity versus role confusion. So we all kind of know that adolescence is really the start of our real identity forming. This is a time of rapid growth. This is where puberty is starting to come in. And children are starting to integrate both their past selves and starting to think about a future self. And it's not just the present, and figuring out what that means, right? Our identity is essentially who I am and how I present that to the world and where I fit in the world around me. So this is the question that is constantly indirectly going on inside them of who am I and how do I portray that? How do I express that? And we're going to unpack a lot more about how to assist children in this, and understanding kind of what's going on in them in this time. But it's going to look like a lot of trying things out, seeing if they're successful in something, seeing if they like it, jumping around peer groups, jumping and really into different interests, just trying to figure out and learn who they are and what they enjoy and what they like. So some kind of emotional, so I'm going to have these slides, you'll see this kind of come up, where this is where I want to talk about some of the typical development and behaviors that you might see within this emotional development, and then where the adoption add-on kind of makes it a little bit more intense, right? So what we're going to see typically under this development behavior section, this is the typical, right? Is this the normal? Exploring, it means making mistakes and changing their minds. And that is normal, right? For them to try things, they need to be allowed space to try and to make a mistake and to try again and to try again and to try again. Allowed to change their minds, right? We don't want this to get so extreme that your child never commits to anything. But sometimes they need to jump around a bit because they're really trying to understand and explore what is important to them and what they enjoy. There's a lot of conflict for these kids between their personal desires and then the parental and societal expectations around them. So you're going to see conflict internally for the children, and honestly conflict probably externally, right? Where they know that they really want to do something and they're learning, hey, I really like this thing, but my parent says no. Or my parent says not right now, or my parent says yes, but you have to have boundaries around that. And so there's that natural clashing that comes in during this time, and that is normal. So often I talk with families that are panicking over any kind of negative or difficult situation that's going on with their child. And what I want to say and often do is this stage, especially for teenagers, that conflict is baked in. It will be present for every single child. So just because you're experiencing it with your adopted child, that is not just the adoption that is making that harder. Now, with something like this and this conflict between personal desires and maybe parental or societal expectations, that adoption add-on could be control battles, right? So if your child is even more prone to control battles, because of their earlier history and trauma, then that's where the adoption add-on makes it a little bit more intense. But to recognize that that conflict is normal. Kids are starting to realize that they like different things, and that is what they want to spend some time doing, and that may or may not always fit in with what their parents want, what their society wants, what school wants. And so that conflict comes up as kids learn, as these teens are learning to navigate through those differences. They're very self-interested. And this should not be always confused with selfishness. This is a stage where they are looking incredibly inward at who am I. So I'm trying to figure out what I want to do, right? There's going to be a lot of I's, not a lot of U's, not a lot of we's. And that is this stage. And it's not just selfishness. It's not a disregard or disrespect for others in malice. It is in the sense that they are really focusing on themselves, but that is natural in this stage. Hormones are affecting their emotions. You're seeing moodiness. We're seeing anxiety, depression, lots of big emotions, right? So that's where toddlers and teenagers are so similar, right? These explosion of emotions without the skills to regulate them in that toddler stage. And then we're seeing it again in the teenage stage. They've got another big explosion of emotions that they can't even really control because of what's going on in their hormones in this stage and what's going on in their physical body. And so I've got a big explosion of emotion, again, lacking the tools to regulate those emotions at a higher level that they will get to as they get into adulthood. This is the messy transitional stage that you get a front row seat in the splash zone for. And it's hard, right? But it is also very normal. This is a time where they're starting to really seek independence. And so, especially if you've adopted a child at an older age and already in this teenage stage, this can be very challenging for you because you are trying to bring them close and attach to them and this brand new child into your family while their internal world is telling them to start pulling away, right? So that conflict and tension is going to really be present if you are starting with this child in adolescence. So that makes it just more challenging. And that pull and that tug of, I want you to be pulled close, and you want to pull close because you want to attach to a loving parental figure, but then you also realize you're supposed to start launching and your body is telling you to start going out and exploring more. So that tension is inherent in what's going on. So additional, I kind of hit on a few of these adoption add-ons, but if you do have some of this arrested development, right? If your child is still stuck in mistrust, they're still stuck in shame and doubt, then they're not really able to progress forward to gain those positive traits in the later stages in their emotional development. So that's the challenge there. And that's where the adoption piece makes this more difficult. The control battles we talked about, if you're already working with a difficulty in attachment, and trust issues from both sides, both from the child and maybe from you as well as the parent. And that's going to impact this emotional state that's going on in your child and in your relationship. And that comes from that adoption history. Any mental health struggles are going to be more common among our adopted kids. So that's going to come into play here. And then your child already kind of having a lack of knowledge of themselves. They maybe didn't have an attentive caregiver that was helping them learn along the way to try out all these different sports and activities and clubs and social groups to where they can get into their teenage years, explore a little more, and then start to settle into who they are. That your child might be coming into this stage with absolutely no connection into anything within themselves. They've not been allowed to have things they like, to want things, because no one was there to provide it to them until coming into your home. So I hear that a lot from families of, we ask them what they want to do and they don't know and they don't want to do anything. And it's like they just have no idea what they could be interested in. Okay, Piaget focused on cognitive development. So this is really understanding what children can and cannot conceptualize at different ages and stages, right? So kind of, again, thinking about that brain development. Are you asking for your child to be able to do something that they need up here, but they aren't there yet? Their brain hasn't developed all the way that way. I'm going to go very briefly through these first ones. A lot of it in ages birth to 2 is that what happens when I do this, right? This is how I learn. So this is why the baby is throwing something on the floor, throwing the toy on the floor, and you pick it up and they throw it on the floor and you pick it up, throw it on the floor until you lose your mind and stop the game. Because they are learning about what happens when I do this. Getting into kind of ages 2 to 7, they're very centered on only one thing. This is where pretend play really comes out. And then going up into ages 7 to 11 is where they're able to start centering on more than just one thing at a time in their cognition. And then the reasoning and logical thinking is only beginning. So again, we're recognizing that this takes many years, takes more than a decade to really settle in for reason and logic. And then if they have any of those adoption add-ons that are working a little bit against them, it's going to take that much slower of a process. So to remember that and allow some space for that. So with what we'd see typically with cognitive development, higher level thinking is only beginning and it's developed through the stages I just said. So it's having some grace for the slow pace of that development. They're seeking independence, but still really need your help. They think they can do so much more than they are actually able to do, or unable to logic through the big picture. And they're very self-interested and self-focused, right? So this is a child that's saying, like, they think if they were the only one that existed in their world in that moment, then sure, what you're doing is logical, but you aren't. You have a world of people around you. You can't behave that way because it impacts other people and it ultimately impacts you moving forward as well, but they can't see that yet. So they're very focused on the thing that they want to do and what they've been centered into. And they still need your help to see that bigger picture, that they don't always want to hear that perspective. So again, that inherent conflict coming up there is very typical and very normal. They're only beginning logical thought, beginning to understand abstract thinking, and only beginning kind of that ethical, moral, philosophical journey into their thoughts. So the adoption add-ons here, control battles, right? If they really are seeking independence in ways that's not age appropriate or not appropriate for their development level, but they want that. And so trying to find where you can share control, where can you give them a little bit more rope while you're still hanging on to it, but they feel like they're gaining a little bit more independence, can help take some of those control battles down. How can you adjust what you're doing with them there? As attachment and trust issues, if that's already going on, because you're still working through that in your relationship, and that can really impact that cognitive development for them, seeking that independence, expecting more from them than maybe they're able to give. And keeping in mind developmental delays and any brain impacts that are particular to your child. Apologize, I've been sick. So on the academic side, which kind of goes here with this cognition, your child has a lot of pressure to achieve as they go into school, and a lot of anxiety can come up from that pressure. They're learning lots of new information in their classes, bigger workloads. It's creating bigger struggles for them. So some of that anxiety is natural and kind of normal in this group, but then you've got the adoption add-on that they may be even more prone to anxiety and fear and insecurities because of their history. Your child might need an IEP or a 504 support, so don't be afraid to seek that from the school, and don't be afraid to push really hard to get that going, because sometimes the schools can brush that off. So keep pushing through for that if you realize that your child really does need some help here. They might be seeing them as more of the typical child, but there's this trauma piece that could make school a little bit more challenging for them that the school is maybe not thinking about, because they're not thinking always through that trauma-informed lens. Schools are getting much better about that, but sometimes they're not. And your child might come into us already with some really low self-esteem. So then they get into the academic realms, very easy for that. well, I can't, I'm stupid, I can't do this, I shouldn't even try, and that kind of taking their academic success down. And some of that because they came into this stage already with very low self-esteem from their earlier history. Okay, Kohlberg is theories of moral development, and I always think this is really good um, for our families as we really think about what's going on in our child's character and in their moral development, and not putting your adult lens onto their behavior and thinking, how do you not see that that's wrong? Or our conceptions as adults of what is right and wrong and how to respond out of that is a much higher level of thinking than where your child might be. So very quickly, these lower stages, birth to 6 years old, everything is motivated to avoid punishment and to receive rewards. It's very self-centered. They're not to understanding right and wrong yet. It's all about, do I get punished for this or do I get rewarded for this? And that's how I'm going to move my behavior and what I see I need to be doing. Say ages 7 to 11, so kind of getting into that preteen years. They are motivated by gaining approval and avoiding disapproval, right? So that view from others, the conformity to the rules around them is really to avoid punishment by kind of the bigger group around them. And that's the motivation, right? So again, when we're looking at this 11-year-old and saying, what was the right behavior here? Why couldn't you do what was right? Why don't you understand what is right to them at this stage of moral development? Isn't what is right in the context of others. It is what gets me approval or what avoids disapproval for me in the context of my school, my peers, my family, whatever those community contexts are around them. And then what's developing in adolescence up into our adulthood is we are motivated, our morals are motivated by um, by kind of conforming to the community around us in a bigger way. And then this emphasis on individual rights will start to come out, right? So that's fair. That's not fair, right? It's something we can hear a lot from kids. My friend gets to do that. It's not fair that I can't. My sibling gets to do that. It's not fair. So that individual right starts to really come up with them around what is right and wrong. And then getting into step 6, where this is really a higher level of morality, right? So this is where we're more operating on, and then our developed values and beliefs and faith and all of these things that impact our moral decisions are developed for us as adults, and it's only starting. Remember back earlier, I said those values, those beliefs, those morals are only starting to form for them throughout adolescence. And it's really not until we get more into adulthood where we're going to be more appropriately morally driven. And that's where that right and wrong with other people around us start to come into play, and what informs my conception of right and wrong. So I kind of talked about what is typical, those adoption add-ons that can be very challenging in moral development for our adopted kids. Is a lot of them are still in their survival skills from their life before coming into your home, operating and lying and manipulation, utilizing these really negative behaviors, and that can come out in this moral way, right? And how they're treating others, how they're following the rules or not following the rules. If you've adopted a child that comes from what we describe as like a shame-based culture, there's guilt-based cultures and there's shame-based. Our American culture is very guilt-based. Things are right and things are wrong, and you do not do the wrong things and you do the right things, right? That is a big Western world value. But a lot of the other kind of part of the world, the non-Western world, can be very shame-based in their morals and in the way that they respond to other people. So right and wrong really becomes, am I bringing shame onto myself? Am I bringing shame onto my family or my community by my actions? If I am saving myself, my family, my community from shame by lying, by stealing, by doing some of these things that we would consider to be bad behavior, it's often more accepted because you're saving face, you're saving yourself from shame. So if you've adopted internationally and maybe your child comes from one of these countries, that's something to keep in mind, that that is more baked into their culture, and how very different we hold that value in America, and what our society kind of views that. And so being mindful of that influence, and then it's not just that your child is a compulsive liar with all kinds of mental health disorders and they're going to become this terrible criminal when they're adults, right? Is where our brains start to go and spiral to. But instead, they just might be operating out of some cultural influences, their survival skills of what they had to do to make it to the point where they are. You're also dealing often with kids in adoption having an overactive reward center of the brain. And so they're really, that motivation to gain a reward lasts much longer, where that they should start to grow out of that as they start getting into adolescence, but it can hang around a lot longer. This is where some of those risky behaviors start to come in, because there's that dopamine reward, that gratification, that instant gratification that is kind of lingering in them for a lot longer. That's that adoption add-on there. Some of our kids are more impulsive, right? They're more prone to impulsive behaviors because of their early trauma, because of the impacts on their brain. And that's going to impact what we see of them morally, right? If they're acting impulsively and harming themselves or others because of those impulsive decisions. And they might lack earlier healthy moral development, that they didn't gain the steps along the way in this chart here, to kind of build up to that higher level of morality. Okay, just to touch on physical development, I don't have a theory I'm really going to go through in this, but just to kind of keep in mind what's going on physically, as an overview in our teenagers' bodies, right? So hormones are raging and that's impacting them emotionally, that's impacting them through puberty and their sexual development. That's impacting, yeah, a lot of things. Like, we know this, we all went through this teenage stage. We may or may not remember all of it, and just how we acted. You know, you could certainly ask your parents how you were a parent as a teenager. But knowing how those hormones can come out and just set them off, they're moodier, they're more prone to just snap and change moods, right in the moment. They can't always understand why, right? I think even just as a woman, right, I understand that there are times that I go through hormonal changes and I'm upset and I don't even know why I'm upset. I'm just more testy and it's because of my hormones. So being able to recognize how hormones really impact, and especially if your child is about to or just hit puberty and you're seeing this uptick in these difficult behaviors or these difficult emotions, recognizing what's happening in their physical body in that time. Significant growth is happening. Their bodies are awkward in this stage, especially at the beginning, and weight gain is very normal, right? And so coming into really considering body image issues in this stage that is so challenging for teenagers, but then also being mindful of your own body image issues and what you are bringing into your parenting and what is still in us, right? So this is that giving yourself compassion and honesty of, how do I view body image, and has my child gained weight and I'm putting a negative value on that because of my own values around body image, where instead they're just growing into an adult body and they are not a child's body anymore. And so there are just natural changes that come along with that. And it's something to pay attention to, but it's not something to overly emphasize. So being first mindful of the way you're approaching body image in yourself and in your family and what messages are being given to your children, and being mindful of potential disordered eating issues that can come up through all of that. And that's all very typical, right, for teenagers, for them to start really wrestling through this. And every child's development pace is going to be different, right? And when they grow up, when they grow out, when they hit puberty, when they develop in certain ways, this is such a fluid time. So it's a lot of ups and downs, a lot of changes at different paces, a lot of comparison that your child will start to struggle with when they view other peers and how they fit in and how they compare to that. again, because of that identity development, right? Who I am, how I show that around to the world, and where I fit in the world around me. That physical development can come into play there. So some adoption add-ons, underlying mental health issues can start to come out with some of these kids. Some of these mental health issues don't develop until teenage years, until into adulthood. So some of that can start to come out. Special needs, and just being mindful if your child obviously has medical special needs, how that can be impacting their physical development. If they have any abuse history, especially any sexual abuse or emotional abuse that can be impacting them coming into this season. And then our adopted kids can be at higher risk for substance use and sexual activity because of what's been going on in their brains, because of their trauma history, because of how they are dealing with their emotions, how they're dealing with fitting in with their peers. They can be at a little bit higher risk for that. So being really mindful of your child's substance use and any risky behaviors they might be engaging in. My Maslow hierarchy of needs chart is not showing up. But what this looks like is it looks like a pyramid. Okay. And so at the very bottom are the physiological needs. So this is our basic needs, right? For food, for water, for shelter, for being kind of physically cared for. On top of that is our security needs. So that is not just knowing that they're safe and secure, but also feeling that way, right? So we often talk about if your child is having food insecurities, if they're having hoarding issues, if they're fearful about getting food, they're overeating, putting a basket of healthy snacks on the counter that they can take at any time. There's no restrictions to that. They can eat the whole basket in one sitting if they need to, right? And that hopefully that starts to taper off as they realize that they are safe, that they have food. Food is always provided to them. It wasn't before, but now it is. And that's felt safety, right? So then on top of that is belonging and love and connection. And then you start to get into higher needs like self-actualization. And so what's important about that and to keep in mind and why I wanted to include this, especially for our teenagers, is we might be expecting them to be at a much higher level in understanding their needs and how to get their needs met and trusting that their needs will be met. But they lack the foundation of knowing their body needs are going to be cared for, their security needs are going to be cared for, their love and their desire to feel connected and bonded. Those are those needs have to be met first before they can start to go to higher level. So being mindful of maybe what your expectations are and why doesn't this child trust me? Because they still don't think they're going to get food. They still don't think that food's going to be provided to them because the food structure is very strict and they can't have snacks or they can't eat outside of meals, or if you've set up a system where that's not as available, right? So just for that one example. So just being mindful of those lower level needs before we can expect higher from our children. Okay, a couple of additional thoughts, and then we're going to go into a little bit more breaking down each age through adolescence, kind of starting at 13, about some other things that you might see as typical child behavior. So some just random additional thoughts here. I mentioned this earlier, but being mindful of where you are applying your adult level logic and reasoning into your child's intention and behavior. How are you viewing what they're doing through, I can't believe you're doing this because I wouldn't do it, right? Or because other people wouldn't do it, but not recognizing it's because they're adults and that's why they wouldn't do it. And these children aren't able to do that yet. These teenagers, even though they're starting to look like adults and they're starting to sound like adults and they're trying to act like an adult, they aren't there yet. And so just being mindful of where that's changing your expectations, changing your frustration, your challenges with what you're experiencing with your child. Remember that they're often acting out of fear, insecurity, or feeling out of control, and not necessarily maliciousness. And we often look at every behavior, that hypervigilance, right? And that fear that's getting triggered inside of us, and the lack of trust and attachment that hasn't yet built between our child and us. We can view everything they're doing through a lens of malice, that they are doing this to hurt me. They are doing this to hurt our family. They're doing this to reject us. They're doing this because they don't want to be here. And the child might feel some of those things. They may not they may feel like this place is hard for me. But ultimately that is their fear. That's their insecurity and them feeling out of control. So just being mindful of those feelings going on inside of them, and that's impacting their behavior as well as inside of you and what's impacting your behavior towards your child. Watching that you are not assuming everything about them, but really seeking to understand and assuming their intent, right? There's assuming malice when really they're just self-interested, right? They're not realizing that the decision that they made really does impact other people because their brain isn't conceptualizing that. They were just trying to take care of themselves. They are just trying to make sure they got theirs because they're not there yet to understand. I also have to make sure everyone else gets theirs as well. It's not just about me. And so if you seek to understand, they need to feel heard. That doesn't mean that you always agree with them. It doesn't mean you allow them to do whatever they want to just because they've told you. But finding every place that you can allow that child to feel heard, even in conflict, even in frustrations. Hey, we all need to take a break. Let's all cool down. And then I want to come back and I want you to share with me again. I can see that you're upset. Why? Tell me what's going on. What makes you feel angry and upset right now? Why are you mad? It seems like you're mad at me. Why are you mad at me? You can tell me. Oh, because it's not fair because you're making me do something that my friends don't have to do or my brother doesn't have to do. It's just not fair. Okay, now we can talk about that, right? And we can work through that underlying problem instead of just dealing with the discipline issue of the way that they're behaving. Remembering you're the adult that leads the interactions, not them. It is hard, and that is not lost on me, that when you are in a hard cycle with your child and feeling rejected or feeling pushed back from them, it is very hard for you to approach them again, to come to them again, vulnerability, because you could get hurt, you could get rejected, but your child feels the same way. And so someone has to take a step forward. And my challenge to you is to remember that you are the adult in the situation that has some of this logical, right? And ability to reason. And so taking the initiative, doing what you need to do to take care of yourself so that you can muster up the ability to take the initiative again with your child, because that burden ultimately rests on you as the adult and as the parent. Find support for yourself in that. So again, all of these things that we're talking about today, I understand those challenges, right? And how hard it can be with parenting these children, whether you're dealing with the typical behavior on its own or the typical plus that adoption add-on that's making it more sensitive and hard. It is hard. It's draining. It's exhausting for you. It's confusing. It's overwhelming. So many different feelings. So finding ways to support yourself, for your spouse, to find support from others. We have a lot of resources here at the agency, but reaching out to other adoptive and foster parents to get support for yourself in this, to keep pushing through these hard teenage years. They're hard to parent, and just because it's hard doesn't always mean that something is wrong. So I see that a lot with families of, oh, a child's acting this way. This means that we aren't a right fit. This isn't a good place for them. No, it's just hard. It's just hard. You took two completely different people and smashed their worlds together. It's just hard. There's tension that is baked into that you just have to work through. Okay, so for about 10 minutes, maybe a little less, we're going to kind of breeze through this. I'm happy to provide this PowerPoint for you, but all of this information is taken from this website here on the page from this group called Coral Care. You could probably just Google Coral Care developmental milestones teens and it would bring it up for you. But the link is there on the screen if you want to take a picture of it. So at 13 years old, what's going on developmentally, right? So in speech, a lot of metaphors, a lot of slang, a lot of text speak, right? A lot of 6, 7, the stuff that we don't really understand always as the adults or think it's silly, that our parents thought the things that we said were silly too. They love to debate and argue, right? And at 13 years old, their opinions are silly sometimes. But they're ready to argue. They're ready to start to fight for that, right? That identity development is, this is what I think, and I'm going to make sure you know it. And I'm going to push back when you don't think the same way, or I'm just going to push back on you to push back. Just because I am trying to learn who I am and where I fit into this. So they're going to naturally argue. They're insecure, lots of mood swings going on emotionally. Cognitively, they're only beginning to start to understand consequences of their actions. And all along the way, if they've been in your home for longer than their teen years, you've been hopefully teaching them some of that, right? That's where these natural consequence lessons start to come in. Hey, when you do this, then this happens. When you do this, this happens. And so in the adolescent years, we're hopefully getting into the stage where that's starting to click and they do want to change their actions because they do start to really understand those consequences. They're relying a lot on friends and social media for their information, which can be challenging for you as the parent, but that's a very typical and normal thing. They're reaching out to their peers. They're increasingly kind of gaining and trying to gain independence from their family, testing limits, pushing boundaries, and facing a lot of peer pressure. Trying out clothing styles, mannerisms, attitudes, especially with clothing and some of these things that are very, what's popular among the kids and their focus on that. I've heard families talk about kids like they're so materialistic, and maybe there's a lot that comes from that, right? The adoption add-on there is they've had nothing their whole life, and they don't really know where the boundaries are and what can be given to them or not given to them yet. They weren't taught that in your home from a very young age. But then it's also really common for them to want to try out lots of new things that can look like they only care about things. But it's really their exploration of themselves and their environment. 14 years old, we're starting to see them better express their feelings through talking, um, concern about body image, looks, clothes, focus on themselves, even more moodiness and more stress, right? Especially as they're 14, they're starting to get more into high school and some more stress and anxiety coming from that. They do start to develop a stronger sense of right and wrong, right? So that moral development is starting to change in this age range, and starting to have more of an understanding of what we would conceptualize as right and wrong, and it not just being about rewards or punishments. They challenge solutions presented by adults, right? That independence, that identity development. They're more often embarrassed by their parents. They can begin to recognize their own strengths and weaknesses, and that's where some of that low self-esteem, that low self-worth, that shame and doubt that can be lingering from some of these earlier stages can really come in and really dragging them down in those weaknesses. More interest in their peer groups, more influenced by their peers, rude and short-tempered with their parents, and maybe showing less affection. And then romantic interests can start to tick up, right? So again, we're talking through what is typical, right, with our kids. And then we've talked about a lot of these adoption add-ons that you can start to understand how it makes some of these things a little more sensitive. 15 years old, they're starting to communicate more in adult-like fashion, can hold appropriate conversations, still using slang, right? Especially when speaking with their friends. Body image, still a big thing. Um, but some more emotional regulation skills are starting to come out and develop. Uh, they're starting to explain some more reasoning behind their choices, right? And then that frontal lobe is starting to click in a little bit better of a way as we start to get a little older in adolescence. Have specific hobbies and interests are starting to settle down as they've been exploring, trying to understand, okay, this is really where I want to settle into, and the clubs I want to be in, and the peer groups. Greater respect for the rules when their privileges depend on their behavior. So we'll see this utilized in discipline, right? That screen time, that grounding time away from your friends can be a better motivator in our discipline as a natural consequence because they're motivated more about keeping privileges and understanding how they can lose privileges. Struggling with peer pressure, still pretty big in this stage, and strong interest in romantic relationships is continuing to grow. At 16, still more abrasive or rude when they're talking, less communicative, loves to argue, right? So that 16-year-old opinion starting to come out. Changes in their language and behavior between what they would see with their peers versus being in the home and the family. There's going to be some regular sulking, some more of those emotional kind of moodiness, but they can start to develop more compassion for others. some more signs of confidence starting to develop in them and making decisions with their independence in mind. They're getting closer to that adulthood. And then starting to increase in resistance to peer pressure as they're starting to get into older adolescence as they work through this. So that peer pressure really coming in the younger stages of adolescence, their identity is starting to form a little bit so they can be more confident of like, no, I don't want to do that. That's not who I am. That's not what I believe. That's not what I think. So that resistance can start to come up and they might begin to kind of come back and relating more to their family. 17, communicate more like adults, still using slang. They can lose track of long, complex questions. So just being mindful if you're trying to talk with them about some bigger concepts, still breaking it down, still moving slow with them because they can get a little bit lost. They're could be feeling more sadness or depression, but they're able to cope with new problems and different situations a little bit better. Giving more reasons for their choices, but still do things without thinking, still very impulsive at this age. Showing more independence from their parents and wanting more adult leadership roles, which is why we see kids, often want jobs during this time, giving them opportunities to lead. So looking for ways that works for your child, given their developmental level, their cognitive level, their emotional maturity level. Finding ways for them to step into some adult-like roles that is still appropriate for who they are, and giving them that felt independence. Hopefully some fewer conflicts with parents, spending less time with parents, more time with their friends, and then searching more for intimacy and connection. And then lastly, here at 18 years old, communicating more like an adult, but can still say the first thing that comes to their mind. Increased capacity for using insight and empathy. Their emphasis is starting to shift from being that that kind of self-centered self-interest onto understanding others and looking to the help of others. So remembering that's at 18 years old, right? So that's a long journey and it's a challenging one to get there, but they can start to do that, just not at those younger ages. They're still very self-interested at those younger ages, managing their emotions in a more socially acceptable manner, testing decision-making skills, but still very idealistic, getting more secure in their autonomy and in that independence and that identity that they've been forming, can evaluate their own opinions instead of just following the opinions of others and starting to transition into what an adult relationship is going to look like. So that is also a big transition for you, parent, as how do I start to relate to this child in a more adult-like way instead of that parent-child relating? Still child, still needs to kind of be there, but it starts to transition and sees their peer group as a less important determinant of behavior. Okay, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to leave this resource page up. You can take a picture of it. I'm also happy to provide this PowerPoint if you contact me. These first three are books that I often turn to with any difficult behavior that I'm going through with my child. The A to Z of therapeutic parenting is really great. It just goes through any kind of difficult behavior issue you may be experiencing with your child and gives kind of the why behind it and some ways to prevent as well as some ways to respond. It's a really great book if you're experiencing a lot of different difficult behaviors that you want some support with. The Connected Parent is kind of the step past the Connected Child. If you read that earlier in your process, it takes all the connected child concepts and adds in some more practical tools and what that looks like in a parenting context. A website I go to often is from the Center for Parent and Teen Communication. They have a lot of really great articles on a lot of great topics. So it's a good one to peruse, do some searching to find some advice for some different things that you might be experiencing. And then again, that Coral Care that breaks down those teen milestones. So thank you so much for joining us. Come back to our YouTube channel to view other webinars. We also have information on our PACC website. It's nightlight.org/PACC that you can see what webinars we have available, what support groups we have available. Any family is welcome to join us at any time. Thank you.